And we're live once again. Welcome back, guys, to another episode of the Solvable Mysteries podcast. My name is Yuras, and as every week, I'm joined by Glenn Highcove. How are you feeling, man, on this Friday evening?
Hey, I'm doing okay. It's kind of a heavy weather week for California. This is like it's for us it's cold and rainy, but I think the rest of the nation would call this like probably the beginning of fall weather while we're like in the middle of winter for us. So yeah, I don't know. Definitely a lot of indoors these days, not getting outdoors, not getting my exercise. So, kind of getting a little stir crazy. I'm ready to talk about some interesting, stuff tonight.
Definitely, dude. Here we had like snowstorms for like the last few days, so it's pretty crazy here as well. Everyone's staying inside. It's definitely it has like a cozy feeling to it, if you know what I mean. When you're like inside and outside, like the weather is like crazy. But today we're gonna be talking about something crazy as well. So, um, I don't even know how to introduce this case because this is really crazy, and I think you have a better understanding of like the general angle that we're going to be playing today in regards to this case. So, for the introduction, dude, I know that you've prepared to introduce the audience to this case. So just have at it, man.
Yeah, sometimes there's something so big that maybe the best way to approach it is to take a little piece of it, like a little corner, and then try to make some sense of it, and then work from there. Eventually, to look at the bigger part of it. So it's almost like the joke: how do you eat an elephant? And the answer is one bite at a time. So we're going to do that today. And, in this case, the topic we're going to talk about, everyone at this point, I'm sure, is familiar with the attacks of 9/11. And there's always a lot of controversy, and there's so many different things to look at. I mean, you and I, we've talked about this, doing a show on 9/11 a bunch of times, and there's literally so many different angles you can talk about, whether it's, the air security on the East Coast, or different plots or conspiracy theories or things that went on with the towers. And I think what we're going to do today is we're going to pick a little more obscure part of the whole event, which is called Tower 7. And you can think of that as like an iceberg. An iceberg is mostly under the surface of the water, right? So when you see an iceberg, you're only seeing like a little tiny chunk of it, right? Because underneath the water, there's a lot more going on. But sometimes you can kind of tell what the rest of the iceberg is like by the little piece that you see above the surface. And I think that's what we're going to do today. And interestingly, I think you'll see that some of the things that went on in this event, in many ways, are like an example of the whole, if that makes sense. So I think the other thing that's always interesting is I didn't even really realize, probably until, good, what, 10, 11, 12 years after the event, when I started listening to Joe Rogan a lot, that the thing we were going to talk about today, which is World Trade Center Tower 7, that there was ever any conspiracy. Because whenever you think about 9/11, you think of like the Twin Towers falling, and, people flying airplanes into buildings, and the Pentagon, and, Flight 93, stuff like that. But you don't really, I mean, unless you get kind of deep or you listen to Joe Rogan in the early years, you don't really think about this thing called World Trade Center Tower 7. And I think here's where I'm going to pose a question to you, Uras. So I guess whenever I hear about it, like when Rogan's talked about it or other people have talked about it, the sense I get is that they say, well, when there's smoke, there's fire, and they feel like they see smoke. So they feel like they see something in this event that is different or contrary to the explanations that you'll get if you look it up on Wikipedia, or that you watch I mean, there's been tons of shows and articles. It's been covered a bit, and I always have to wonder. Like, I'll just pose this to you specifically, Ross. Like, what is the smoke that they think that they're smelling? What's the fire that they think is this smoke is signaling, that's different than, let's say, if someone were to just look up in Wikipedia what was Tower 7?
Right. So, first of all, just to I just want to make sure that you could see as well the video because I did
Yep.
saw that. Okay, so right, so you can see it, right, and I'm assuming everyone else could see it on the show, right? So it's really interesting how you said they're seeing smoke, as dude, we can see smoke, right? So we're looking at Tower 7 right now. So that's the Tower 7 that I think it's a lesser known, you know, catalyst for a lot of conspiracies. Now, to answer your question, right, I don't really, I think I know what you've tried to ask me. I think it was like a really intelligently put question. So I will say, I think that they are probably thinking that this was an inside job, right? So that Tower 7 actually had certain demolition devices placed inside of it, and then it fell apart. Now I've seen this video, right, like at least I think 2 times. It's a video that takes up like a half an hour or something like that, and then at the 15-minute mark the building collapses, and I think the time is 6 seconds. That's the quote that I've read yesterday. So buildings usually collapse in 6 seconds, or like these types of buildings, when uh, at least experts, well, it's an interesting topic because there are literally PhDs believing in this conspiracy. So it's not a crazy thing to say, or at least to question, in my opinion, because PhDs, I'm not a PhD and I'm never gonna be one. So if PhDs are thinking that this was an inside job, I mean, who knows, right? So basically, a tower cannot collapse apparently within 6 seconds and super neatly, like just straight down, if like, how should I put, like the columns that hold the structure are not artificially destroyed one piece at a time. Like one story is destroyed, then the second story is destroyed, third story is destroyed, looking from like the looking into the downward direction, right? If the stories are disappearing one by one, that's how you destroy a building in 6 seconds. That's controlled demolition. People are thinking that if it did happen within 6 seconds, it's probably something more there. They're like, and just in general, like the general explanation does not inspire confidence, because apparently how Tower 7 fell, and I'm sure you could correct me if I'm mistaken here, but apparently Tower 7 collapsed because a piece of debris actually fell down from one of the two twin towers, hit Tower 7, right? And then Tower 7 became inflamed, and a massive fire began like ravaging the building, right? But these three towers, right? If and you could correct me if I'm mistaken here, but apparently these three towers, the Twin Towers and Tower 7, are the only towers in the history of towers, of like skyscrapers, that have collapsed due to fires. Because there have been so many examples. Like we had that crazy fire in Madrid, I think in the 80s or 90s, I can't recall. The whole building was inflamed, and it burned for like almost 24 hours, so almost a whole day of burning, but it didn't collapse. Like you had crazy things like that. I think there was in the 80s, if I'm not mistaken, there was a airplane, like but like a one person passenger airplane, something like that. So a small plane hit, I believe, the Empire State Building, or maybe some other building, but I think it was the Empire State Building. I think it was 84, but I could be mistaken. It hit like the building, but literally nothing happened. Like just some firefighters went up in there, they cleared out the fire, and that's pretty much how that situation got handled. But now you have on the same day, the only three towers in the history of towers collapsing due to fire. So I don't know where. I don't even remember what you asked me, but this is. I'll let you like react to all of this, dude.
Yeah. No, that I think that's a good that's a good arrow pointing towards what people think literally and figuratively the fire is. So, to your point, one of the things that's interesting is you have some very smart people on seemingly both sides of the argument, right? So you have some people that have kind of amazing credentials, which we'll go into in a bit, signing up for the idea that it wasn't the buildings didn't just collapse because of this, incidental damage and fire from the other two towers collapsing next to them. And then you have a whole bunch of people that are, you know, coming out against that and saying, "Oh no, these are the reasons why." And I think it's good to explore because it is one of those things where, depending on what you hear and depending what you believe, and if you hear a little bit of something, sometimes that's almost the worst because like you almost don't hear all the sides of the evidence on both sides of the argument. So I think it'll be really interesting as we go through this episode to see for both different variations of this, whether the conventional explanation or one of the alternative explanations, the kind of more conspiracy minded. And by conspiracy, by the way, it's interesting because you use the word conspiracy, and I've mentioned this before that conspiracy, unfortunately, ends up being kind of a poison the well kind of word where people hear the word conspiracy and they think just craziness, like that one meme from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia where it shows the guy, or the History Channel guy with the the big hair.
Aliens. Yeah.
Aliens, yeah, that guy. I mean, okay, but here's the thing, like, conspiracy literally means that more than one person conspired. So there's no doubt that 9/11 was a conspiracy, right? So the conventional explanation was there was a conspiracy by Al Qaeda, along with maybe some of its supporters, to create a massive terrorist attack that caused this chain reaction of events, and tragedy. Now the more controversial conspiracy theories are that it was someone other than Al Qaeda, or in addition to Al Qaeda, like false flag attacks and things like that. And that's we're not going to totally cover that today. We're going to touch on it a little bit, but that's, I think, where probably another show that's like a more meta, by meta I mean like a higher level examination of like bigger theories. Maybe that's, if we get enough interest in this topic, that's something we try to tackle one at a time in another show. But this show, I think we're certainly going to we're going to approach and touch some of those topics, but we're really going to make sure it's kind of in the context of how they affect the fall of this building, World Trade Center Tower 7, and whether this building directly is somehow tied into that conspiracy, let's say. So
Right.
that'll be the context of the show. So okay, let's do. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give a quick kind of overview of the building, and I'm going to try to keep it interesting. I mean, I'll fully admit, when I was doing the research for this, when you start reading into it, it gets really technical, and you have to kind of pick through the details and try to construct in your head like, what the heck are they talking about? So here's here's really what's going on is, when they built the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers, that was just part of a bigger complex of buildings. Obviously, the whole point of this was to make a massive financial center in the middle of New York that was attractive to these different tenants. And the tenants were, both public and private. So by that I mean, like you had big government agencies, including the CIA, the FBI, the Secret Service, and the Department of Defense in this building. But you also had massive, like, financial companies that had, like, a bunch of floors in a row in this building. And
Dude,
in fact, yeah,
one question, because I think I want to give you a little bit of a breather, as well as I want to ask you a
yeah,
question because I think you will uh, probably know the answer. So just to clarify, right? Tower 7 was not a residential like building in terms of people living there. It was like office buildings, office spaces, institution spaces, etc. If I'm not mistaken, right?
yeah,
Gotcha.
that's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was really exactly. It's kind of meant like in the old days sense of you go to an office and you get work done. That's what it was made for. And I think even really specifically to that, it wasn't even the kind of office where you would necessarily have like a bunch of offices. Okay, well, that sounds a little weird. Let's put it this way: you think of like kind of some office buildings, like maybe law firms. You need a lot of private space. You know what I mean? So like, this partner will have an office, and that partner, everyone's got like their own little office where you can close a door.
Yeah.
Some good amount of these clients that had office space there, they actually wanted what was called an open floor design. So they wanted, these big areas with a lot of people that maybe could. I mean, now they call it open office, which Google and Apple and some other companies have sort of made new again. What was old becomes new.
Hmm.
But the idea is, maybe you have cubicles and things like that, but it's still pretty open air. Like you could throw a paper airplane across the floor. Let's put it that way, and not hit like a whole hall of offices.
Mm.
So from that perspective, the way they built the building was something called tube frame design. And tube frame design, it actually isn't that complicated. Think about it this way. What you have is you have like kind of a big, huge rectangle going up, right? So if you look at any kind of high rise, um, it's just a big cube going up, right? It's like you took a cube and you just stretched it up.
Yeah.
And the way it's constructed is they have the tubes are basically these big columns. So they have these big columns, and the columns are all around the outside. So think if you took like a big PVC pipe, like a plastic pipe or a metal pipe, and you turn it on its side, right? So you stood it like a giant cylinder, like a big can of Pringles, right? Big can
Hmm.
of Pringles is just a cylinder you put on its edge, right? And then in the center, so there's pipes. There's like by pipes I mean columns. There's columns that are the support on the outside of that Pringles can. And then what if that Pringles can also had like a whole bunch of wires or beams or whatever you want to think of in the middle, support columns in the middle. And then what they would do is to have floors in that Pringles can, you would just basically attach it to the outside and the inside. Does that make sense? So
Yeah,
it's sort of
I
like,
think I
yeah.
think so. Yeah.
So it's interesting because when you do that, you don't lose a lot of floor space to having columns. Because I've been in other buildings that have columns that go through like the middle of the floor, right? Where it's more like, um,
Yeah.
I don't know, instead of being a Pringles can, you know what I mean? It's
Hmm.
it's
Yeah. I
yeah,
know.
it's
Yeah.
it's it's just yeah, it's just something where there's a lot more pillars going through it. But what's nice is when there's not problems and when
Oh,
everything's kind of working well,
it's just
you have
collapsed.
yeah, yeah. I mean, when there's not problems, you have like these metal floors called trusses that span across, like I said, that make the floors, and they can support all the weight. So this kind of metal and steel, this metal and glass, and some concrete, of course, structure is actually pretty sound normally. So when you don't have emergencies, okay, it works pretty well. And that's really the case for a lot of different high rises. And you look, I mean, it works. Let's face it, we don't have a lot of disasters with giant skyscrapers. And you'll have you have all these cities and places like Los Angeles, I'm sorry, buildings in cities like Los Angeles or Tokyo that have earthquakes all the time. And like, no buildings are really falling down that much, right?
Yes.
Like it's not a big issue. Um, okay. So with that being said, they built this thing and it was 47 stories tall. This building, it there was a little bit of legacy they had to build on. So originally there was a like a Con Ed substation that was down there, like an electrical station that had its own kind of foundation that was smaller than what they built. There's like a big long-winded thing in Wikipedia about how they had to like build on top of this old foundation and they had to like build more foundations, and then like one of the floors somehow focuses all the pressure and weight. Look, it's a long-winded thing that I'll just give you the short version is that they built a building that was meant to stay up and seemed to do a pretty good job of holding the weight in the structure. Like there was not really any reports, unlike the Twin Towers, which there's a Joe Rogan clip where I watched where I think Alex Jones was saying that there were some problems with the Twin Towers even before 9/11 with the building starting to lean and bulge and things like that. But there wasn't any of that stuff going on with this tower.
Mm.
Um, it's also interesting that, to your point, so what happened was historically the big worry, especially in big high rise New York with all this air traffic coming in. New York's got like what, two or three airports in the immediate area, and it's got other major airports that are nearby enough that, yeah, they were worried for a long time that an airplane gets lost in the fog, especially in the old days, and goes and plows into the building. And it had happened, and it had never happened with like these huge airliner sized airplanes. They were like smaller World War II era airplanes. And there's also been like, little Cessnas that have crashed into skyscrapers since then. I think even when one was maybe related to kind of post 9/11 terror stuff. But yeah, there never been like a big 757 or 767 full of fuel plowing into a skyscraper, because that's really not what you'd expect anyway. No one really thought that was going to happen, but they said, look, it could happen, and they really thought they had it covered. So
Dude, just
yeah.
to give you a quick breather, and I think it's a good point, a good place, a really good place for me to stop it for a few seconds and add the one crazy detail here, because I think it correlates very perfectly with what you're saying, that no one expected it to happen. Well, the dude who owned, right, the towers, the both twin towers, right, I believe he purchased them on the same year, and I believe 6 weeks before they collapsed, he actually took out like a some sort of insurance policy. There was something else to it, like the contract was bigger than just the insurance policy, some other stuff. There was a specific insurance policy. Well, I don't say it's specifically covered for airplanes hitting the towers, but that, I think you need to add that detail in for terrorist acts regarding airplanes, to be like, you have to add that into the clause. It's not gonna, you're not gonna get paid out the money if you didn't add that in. So he did add that in. I mean, if I was in his position, I would probably add that in as well if I'm already purchasing, you know, insurance on my twin tower buildings. But he did it 6 weeks prior, right? And then he actually claimed twice the money after the fact, but he only got granted, I believe, 2.2 billion or something like that. He asked for 9 billion because he viewed it as a double act of terrorism. So since there were two planes, you know, hitting the towers, he claimed twice as much money, but he didn't get that money. He only got like 2.2 billion. So when you said that no one expected it, the owner of the buildings sort of did a little bit 6 weeks prior. So that's interesting, right?
Yeah, and it is worth, it's a good point, because it's worth mentioning. Maybe not everybody knows this, but the Twin Towers had been targeted by a terrorist act in the early 90s. I remember when I was in high school, they tried to basically set off a bomb in the underground parking area or loading area or something like that of one of the towers. A bomb did go off, but it didn't really cause substantial damage. It did kill, I think, a maintenance person or something. Um, but that was sort of the first scare that they would try this, and it was actually a different set of terrorists that tried that. And then B, Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda were in fact quite busy doing other terrorist attacks against U.S. Facilities in other parts of the world before this. So okay, it wasn't. It was for sure
Yeah.
not unexpected that Al Qaeda might try something. So that makes sense. And case in point, this kind of really visual, striking landmark that was seen as a symbol of, I guess, American imperialism and financial, status might get targeted. So, all right, I get that. Finally, just to wrap up about the construction of the building and get into the tenants. Um, this is also during an era. The building was built during an era where they stopped using asbestos. So if anybody doesn't know what asbestos is a substance that they used to use for fireproofing, because it's super awesome. Like, it's almost impossible to light asbestos on fire. Um,
Oh, for real?
like,
Okay.
yeah, it's like, it just is not flammable. Unfortunately, it'll also give you something called, what's it called? Mesothelioma. It's a different, basically a kind of, I think it's a form of lung cancer. Yeah, it's super bad for you. So it's one of the things, like, don't ever go into like an old building, or like, if you ever do demolition on an old building, make sure you know what it was made out of, because
Dude,
yeah, you can have some real problems.
just a quick stop here. I know that, you know, the building that sort of we have, like this little cottage, right, which was built like back in the late 90s, in the other city, that we sort of stay there during the summers and things like that. Dude, I know that like the bottom layer is like filled with asbestos and stuff like that. So now when you said that it gives lung
Yeah.
cancer, dude, I don't know what to do right
uh,
now, dude. I don't know what to do right now.
I I mean, the main thing about asbestos is it's the most dangerous when you're like ripping it out. So if it's just sitting there, I mean, the fact is, a
It's
lot of
exposed a little
acoustic
bit,
tiles.
like it's exposed a little bit, dude.
It might be okay. I mean, the fact is, I know that for a fact that a lot of like roofing materials, like ceiling materials. I mean, like the ceiling of the room, a lot of that stuff was made with asbestos, even in like schools and stuff. So, I mean, at the end of the day, the main problem is when you're doing demolition. When you're doing demolition, you're tearing all that
Okay.
crap out. Yeah, that's when it gets super dangerous because it starts, spreading stuff in the air. If it's just sitting there by itself, it's like, yeah, don't go rubbing your face on it. But maybe it's doing its job.
Yeah.
Okay, so the building opened in May 1987, and I'll just quickly some of the tenants were so one of the biggest tenant by far was Solomon Smith Barney, who became famous later during the financial collapse several years later. It occupied something like 64% of the building. So, case in point, it was floors 28 to 45. And there were, some insurance companies. There was some banks, like American Express, two banks so far that I have here. And, you and I were talking about earlier the big time SEC, so Securities and Exchange Commission, that
Oh yeah.
regulates, yeah, financial markets. So, that's definitely a huge organization, very important in that building. And then we had tenants like everybody's favorite, the IRS, so Internal Revenue Service, regional counsel was there, the Secret Service, so that's Treasury Department, people that protect the president and also um, protect our currency and things like that. And New York City Office of Emergency Management, interestingly, so that probably helped contribute to some of the problems we saw later when this building, the emergency management centers, the one that's like part of the emergency, not so great. Insurance commissioners, and of course, we found out later, both the Department of Defense and the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA,
So
was
literally
also
everyone.
there.
Literally everyone, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was like if you could take a whole bunch of important organizations and put them all in one building. Um, it's kind of amazing that that wasn't struck first. If you think about it, like what was
Yeah.
Bin Laden doing messing with these other two towers that were full of stock traders when you had this building full of government stuff? Yeah, it's interesting. So, and it's also interesting, by the way, that that power station had something like, I'll see the number again. I think it was 27,000 gallons of diesel fuel in it. I know it was for emergency generators. So they had 20, but they don't actually think that was a major part of the fire. I think diesel, unlike what you guys in Europe call petrol, but we in America call gasoline, I don't think diesel is nearly so volatile, or easy to catch fire.
I will probably agree here. Well, I will definitely agree because I'm not an expert, and I just know that diesel cars, right, like the one that I have, they have a really hard time starting at below zero temperatures,
Yeah.
and the gasoline or petrol, or whichever way you want to call it, seems like it's the more flammable, the more stronger substance, like the stronger substance, if that makes any
Yeah,
sense.
yeah, it's super explosive. In fact, diesel engines, just a side note, diesel engines don't have spark plugs. So the way diesel engines, the only reason why the diesel makes a little explosion to push the cylinder is from compression.
Okay.
So while gasoline, like, it needs a spark plug to set off the explosion to the compression. So okay. I forgot one last tenant. So this is anybody that's maybe my age or a little older. Drexel Burnham Lambert, which was a big part of the '80s insider trading junk bonds scandal, was also one of the tenants there. So Michael Milken's, at least former partners, I think. I'm not sure if he was a full partner there or just they were associated with him, but that was, it was kind of like the who's who of government and like
Wow.
80s, 90s, and early 2000s finance. So yeah. So okay.
I will say, yeah,
Uh,
yeah, just to give you
yeah,
a breather, because I know that you have like the fleshed out whole thing. I just have like a whole bunch of interesting details. So
yeah,
I know that you're doing the heavy lifting here. I think everyone should appreciate that you're like really putting in work right now. And I definitely want to give you like a breather. So one thing that I want to mention about Tower 7, well, first of all, for everyone who's on our YouTube channel listening to this podcast, right, I've been showing like clips from Tower 7 a little bit earlier in the show. I think we will return to that one clip just to see the time when it collapses, because I've said it collapsed really fast. I think we could like view it a couple of times and decide if it looks natural or not. Right now we're just looking at the twin tower footage, the best footage that I could find, right? And it's pretty cool, right? So, but just to emphasize, we're actually talking about Tower 7, not the Twin Towers right now, because the Twin Towers, like, it's too big of a topic to cover in one go. But I think Tower 7 was definitely a good pick for us, because we could cover Tower 7 in one go, right? So one thing I want to mention about Tower 7 that I found very interesting is that SEC, that institution that pretty much regulates the stock market, the stock exchange, makes sure that there's no pump and dump schemes going on, right, in the stock market, right? Well, it's questionable if they're doing their job right, or anything like that, especially these days for various reasons. But I will say that they had a whole bunch of documents in Tower 7, a whole bunch of SEC documents, and SEC documents is not, if you're like a business, right, or like a businessman, etc., etc., you probably don't want to be on SEC documents. That's probably not a good thing to be on, because it's usually never a good thing, right? When SEC has like files on you, it's never a good thing. So all of these files got destroyed, and that means that a lot of people, I think, got scot-free out of this whole situation, because maybe they were like serious like cases being built against certain organizations or people. And to my understanding, those documents were lost. So when we're talking about whether or not like there was something to gain from destroying Tower 7, for like the elite, for certain elite people, the society, the American society, there was something to be gained, in my opinion, in destroying Tower 7. So I just want to emphasize the fact that sure, it's a conspiracy, but don't know what happened. At least I personally don't know what happened, especially recently when I was looking into all of these interesting details. But I will say that it's, the interest is there for some people to destroy Tower 7, filled with SEC documents and all of the other institutions that you've mentioned: CIA, Homeland Security, Secret Service. There's a bunch of documents that if they get destroyed, I don't know, I think someone wins at the end of the day if that happens. So that's all
Yeah,
I wanted to say,
that
dude.
was that's a. I mean, it's a good point because two things. One is that's literally sorry, spoiler, but sorry. I mean, it's been more than 20 years. That's the end of Fight Club, right? So at the end of Fight Club, the whole plot is they're going to destroy all these high rises in New York, and that's where all the records are kept. It's like an eerie,
Oh, wow.
like, yeah, foreshadowing of what happened in New York, right? And that, I think that part of the movie is actually set in New York. So it's one of those weird things where fiction sort of predicted reality, and it's not like I think like Bin Laden was watching that, right? It's I'm not blaming Fight Club for what happened, but I'm saying it is interesting that he is out there, and it's also worth pointing out that, yeah, I mean, you're right, because it's so weird. Like, now when you think about it, now in this age of cloud computing and Google and all these other big companies that have just server farms and parking lots full of trailers with like hard drives and stuff everywhere, that wasn't the case. This is still the early days of the internet. And no joke, I took, when I was taking my MBA classes after that, and I was specializing in the IT side of things, one of the things that was accurate back then was literally the fastest way to send a lot of data across the country wasn't over the internet. It was putting somebody on a plane with a DVD
What?
or a CD-ROM. Yeah, yeah. Like, literally, if you wanted to send a terabyte across the United States, the fastest way to do it was to send that person to the airport and jump on a plane with a, like a bunch of like literally tapes.
Dude,
Yeah, no,
I,
that's
I,
it's real.
I wonder how
Yeah.
did anything even get done back in the day?
I mean, no, no, no joke, dude. When I was working for, I won't say what studio I was working for, literally the video commercials that I would run for my clients, they would literally send it FedEx. So that was the only
Wow.
way, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, it wasn't there yet. You know what I mean? Like, all that, all there was good internet infrastructure, but it wasn't built for massive data yet. So that makes sense that, yeah, like, literally there were still pieces of paper in buildings or hard drives in buildings that hadn't been backed up. You know what I mean? Or tapes. Like tapes have been backed up, but guess where they're living?
Yeah.
They're living like in buildings like that. So
Crazy.
it's not like now we're like, yeah, don't think that you can do that now and blow up a building. Now, like if you mess up your credit report, well, guess what? Like that's duplicated in 100 different places, and like it's not going away. There's no, like it could probably be a nuclear war, and they'll still know how much you owe in your visa. So, oh well. Um, but
Yeah.
yeah, so okay, let's get into it. So, look, we already alluded to this. There's no surprise, and we'll probably cover this in more depth later. But there was an attack on 9/11. There were two different planes that were flown into the two biggest buildings in that whole area, which were the Twin Towers. The attacks were a little bit of time apart. The conventional explanation is that um, had Al Qaeda leveraged terrorists doing suicide attacks who took over airplanes that were full of fuel because they'd just taken off and they were cross country flights. So they were, they had the most fuel they would have
Yeah.
for that airplane type. And they flew it right into buildings. And those buildings caught on fire in a massive way. And in fact, supposedly, even bin Laden was surprised what happened. So bin Laden thought there was going to be a fire and a big mess and there was going to be a big scene. Even bin Laden and Al Qaeda did not think that the buildings were going to come crashing down. So maybe it makes you wonder if they would have done it still, if they could have known what happened. I don't know. That's probably another show. But okay. So as a result of this, what happened was the two towers fell down. It's still, I mean, I don't think there's anything short of like a nuclear explosion. I don't think there's anything as dramatic as the that footage of what happened. I mean, I was in my early 20s at the time, and it just floored everybody. Everybody was in shock. But what happened to Tower 7 was that heavy debris. So just think about this: these two huge buildings, which were two of the largest buildings in the world. They weren't the largest, but they were massive. They're right next to Tower 7. They come crashing down in just this crazy avalanche of just stuff. I mean, the buildings just turn into rubble and dust and smoke and crap and fire everywhere. Well, some of it hit Tower 7. Now, the interesting thing is they don't think necessarily that the fuel from the planes was what caused well, sorry, was what the massive fires were in Tower 7. So the theory is that yeah, like a bunch of stuff hit the building, and then what was the actual persistent fire that got going in Tower 7 was from all the other crap, all those pieces of paper and furniture and carpet
Just
and
to
chairs and things like that. Yeah.
just to give you another reader, I think one of the main, like, if you're gonna go by the official story, right? Apparently, what really helped the twin towers to collapse, right, was the jet fuel, because apparently jet fuel, that big meme, jet fuel can burn steel beams, whatever. I used to never understand what it meant, but I think somehow, like, the jet fuel that was in the airplane, or the airplanes, I should say, that hit the towers, right? Apparently, that jet fuel was the reason why the steel beams collapsed pretty much, or it at least melted the steel beams to such degree that the building would collapse on each other pretty much. So I think this has
Yeah.
been rebuted by other
That
people. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So that yeah, just to clarify, so that is the case for
Okay,
towers 1 and 2. That's what they think is yeah, for sure. Like you said, it's just like petrol.
yeah,
It's super flammable, and airplanes are basically big flying gas balloons. Like they're not airplanes are not as solid as they look. That's why a human being can act like one of those big strong men. Sometimes you see them, they'll like pull like a 737 with their teeth or something.
yep,
Like when they're empty, they're really not that heavy. They're really they're mostly hollow airplanes. Besides the part with the passenger it's just like thin-skinned aluminum things that you then pump a bunch of gasoline into, and they kind of just they make them just as only as strong as they can, like, have them still go in the air full of liquid, and the liquid is gas, which, they're gonna burn on their way anyway. So yeah, that is for sure the case with the twin towers. What they're saying is it wasn't it wasn't what necessarily made so much fire, or it wasn't all the fire that was going on in Tower 7. So for one and two, yeah. Like one and two, I mean, you can see it in the videos. You can see the airplane hits, and it's like, it's an explosion like you would see in the movies. Like a lot of times, explosions in the movies are actually really fake because they take a bunch of gasoline type stuff and they blow it up and it makes a big fiery explosion. But then if you see like real bombs or grenades or things like that go off, like they don't look like that. They're really dirty and brown and black, and they have a lot of fragments and stuff in them. They don't look like those big fireballs. But like the twin towers, that's, undisputably massive fireball coming out of the building when they hit, because that's what it is. It's a big gas water balloon hit the airplane, at extreme velocity. Now it's worth mentioning that, like, ideally, had these other disasters not happened in the area, a building like Tower 7 supposedly was supposed to be ready for a fire like this. So not a whole, 757 full of gas hitting it, but for like some kind of impact from an airplane and some kind of fire. Like, yeah, fires happen in high rises, like you mentioned. I mean, it happens all the time, and you never really had anything like this happen. The problem is, I think that the fact that a massive disaster already happening suddenly subtracted away from the firefighting
Yeah.
infrastructure that there was. You know what I mean? So these two big buildings falling down are for sure going to wreck a bunch of pipes and water mains and things in the area. And then it turns out that, like, not having power and not like some of the stuff in the building to even fight a fire needed to have like power and some other, energy systems going on. So what you kind of had, and I think this is something that maybe is a theme of this, is sometimes a big disaster can kind of snowball into a bigger and bigger and bigger disaster, and it almost runs away like a fire. Like how, like, a fire starts in a room of the house, and pretty soon the whole house is on fire because, like, what was bad got worse.
Yeah.
Like, that's kind of what happened here. So unfortunately, as this fire got going in Tower 7, this is the theory, this is the conventional theory, the fire gets going. You've already had these two towers collapse and kill a bunch of firefighters. So you already lost some of the people that you were going to use to fight the fire. If this had just happened in Tower 7, if the other stuff hadn't happened, you already lost, like, what, hundreds of firefighters, and it's chaos and stuff's wrecked everywhere. People are running around. It's how do you even control that? And then your emergency control center was supposed to be like in that building, right? But the building's on fire. Um, so yeah, unfortunately, what happens is, like at some point, as this fire is burning in the building, and they're trying to kind of they're playing like whack-a-mole, trying to put out these pockets of fire, but they have low water pressure. The fires are burning over the course of the day, and during the afternoon, I mean, they're just seeing fires all over the place in this building. So they're seeing fires on 6 to 10, 13 to 14, 19, 22, 29. I mean, just up and down the building. They're seeing different parts of it on fire, and it's burning persistently. And they say at about 2 o'clock, firefighters notice a bulge in the southwest corner of the 7 World Trade Center. So Tower 7, between 10 and 13. That's bad, right? If there's a bulge at the bottom of the building,
Can
like,
can
that's what's
I?
holding up.
Yeah, I just want to
Yeah,
ask
right.
a question because when you said the bulge, right? I'm curious what that really is, and at which floor was this? Because I think do you know this information? Because I don't, I've never
Yeah,
heard
I,
about
I have
this.
it here from Wikipedia. 10 and 13th, so low
Oh,
in the building.
and
Like
the
the first
bulge is what is a bulge exactly?
bulge, like part of the building is starting to stick, almost like, I know, like like my belly is a bulge,
Oh,
right?
okay,
So like that's a part of my body that's sticking out because I'm fat there. But like,
okay,
if you had if you had like a bunch of blocks, if you were a kid and you were stacking like a huge Jenga building, right? And then like part of it started to kind of lean and like poke out on one side, like like stuff starting to move out
Mm,
from under the top.
yeah, yeah. Okay,
You
makes
know what I
sense.
mean?
Makes
Yeah,
sense. Yeah, yeah,
yeah. So what happened is also on top of that, the firefighters that are in the building and around it start hearing like they start hearing building like sounds from the building. Like I don't know if you've ever been near, I don't know, a big structure, or like I don't know, I know ever like cut down a tree where like the tree starts making like cracking noises even when you're not doing anything to it. I don't
yeah.
know if you ever like cut down like a, yeah, with like you're like, uh-oh, like stuff's starting to break, like this tree's gonna come down. Well, instead of a tree, it was a massive skyscraper. And so at around 3:30, this is where the chief, well, one of the chiefs of the New York Fire Department decides to halt rescue operations and everything else, and just says we're gonna pull now. They're gonna pull people out of the building now. Um, it's interesting because I just to stick a pin in this point. This is where there's some contention because you'll Rogan always quotes this. Rogan and Alex Jones and some other people say that, hey, way ahead of the building collapsing, supposedly there was like a message that they were going to do like a controlled demolition.
Oh yeah, I've heard about
Or
this,
they
but
were
I
gonna,
don't know. But I
yeah.
don't know the details. But I've heard about this. Yeah.
Yeah, and this it's a real point of contention. Unfortunately, I could not find other than Alex Jones claiming that there was all this stuff from the different news agencies saying, and hey, to be fair, it may have been like there was a lot of misinformation going on that day. You know what I mean? Like it was just rumors and no one really knew what was going on. So it may have been that like one person said, like a reporter said something to someone else,
Yeah.
and it just, you know what I mean? Like no one really verified it, but they may have just really meant like, hey, we're just going to pull firefighters because this thing's going to come down. But yeah, for a long time, the persistent, like Rogan used to repeat this all the time, the persistent idea was that they said they were going to do a controlled demolition, and that's what happened. And then they, you know, contradicted that later. That they, by they, I mean like, the grand they, the government they, you know, retold the story. So that's one conspiracy, right? That like, hey, they took it down because they didn't want it just hanging out there ready to fall into the street.
I
Like
just I
better to
just
have it fall straight down, right?
Yeah, just a quick stop here because I did watch like a really interesting documentary that was like like busting the conspiracy theorists' theories, like debunking them, right? And one of the things they never touched upon Tower Seven. They were mostly talking about the Twin Towers, right? So because twin towers are also allegedly proposed to be demolished, artificially. Because I will say one interesting fact: when you see like the Tower Seven, right, right as it is collapsing down, like the stories below the main top story, that the building starts to collapse from the top, right? So the stories below the top story, there are like some explosion looking things happening in those lower stories that would sort of definitely correlate with how I would assume a demolition would happen. Like, some buildings, like literally like 5 stories or like 6 stories below the main collapse layer, the layer that's collapsing, right? Below that, like explosions are happening in the different levels. So that's pretty cool, and it's on camera, and you could all find this on YouTube. It's really easy to Google that. Also, apparently a lot of firefighters, I believe over 100 firefighters had like their testimonies out there that they heard explosions. Like everyone heard explosions, like literally like almost like 1,000 people heard the explosions after like the hit. So it wasn't like they heard like the airplanes hit. That wasn't even an explosion, but they heard explosions after that, like multiple explosions. Everyone was hearing explosions. And actually Tower 7, I believe, people heard the explosions in Tower 7 as well. But I will say, the thing that I wanted to mention here is that when you said that it could have been possibly after the fact that the government was like, yo, this building is gonna collapse, so let's just put explosions in them and let's make sure that it collapses artificially, because it's better to have a controlled demolition of Tower 7 than it collapsing on itself. That way, we could limit the damage done to the surrounding infrastructure around the Tower 7, right? But on the documentary that I was watching that debunks everyone, they actually stated that a small building, which is apparently like, I would say, at least 6 or 7 times smaller than Tower 7, not even the big towers, but Tower 7, a lot smaller building than the Tower 7, would take up at least 2 to 3 weeks of prep work for the demolition, because you have to like sort of get inside the building, and there's a whole preparation crew before the demolitions even happen, where they sort of have to like work with the columns, like get inside of the columns with like different like tools, like so that you could put dynamite in. So I don't think you could like prepare Tower 7 for demolition like within hours of that. So I think you would need at least like 2 weeks or 3 weeks of prep work before the tower could come down, if that makes sense. So I don't think it's actually possible for the government to like within like 2 hours rush into a building that's about to collapse and then place all the dynamite when like the demolition crew is never gonna do that. They're like, are you crazy? This building is on fire. We're not gonna be placing explosive right now. So that's just one thing I wanted to mention and give you a breather, and that's pretty much all I have, dude.
Yeah, no, that's true, right? Because yeah, I mean the building's literally on fire on multiple floors. It's pretty dangerous to go in there and try to do any kind of detailed work. Um, what one of the things that's worth considering is I think maybe because like as little kids, all of us build with blocks, and you'll like build something really tall, right? And then like I don't know, you would build something with blocks that was maybe like up to your shoulder or something, and then you like push it over, and it falls like a tree, right? It falls, it falls out from its base. Does that make sense? So you push over the top, and it falls like a tree sometimes, where like it falls maybe half its width, half its length or something. Does that make sense
Yeah.
to you? So I think that's a lot of people when they look at like the Twin Towers or Tower 7 or anything big, that's what they think is going to happen. They think like, well, if a building like that, it's going to fall like a tree. But as I understand it, part of it's really kind of a misconception because like unfortunately the things that something like that is made out of is designed for stresses in only a very specific direction. So like while buildings are strong enough to absorb even like earthquakes, well they'll kind of rock, and they're even, I don't know if you know this, a lot of skyscrapers are actually on rollers, like on their like little to not just be rigid when the earthquake happens, to help kind of give
Whoa.
a little bit of, yeah, it's kind of crazy, but there's actually like down the way they're kind of attached to their foundations, especially here in Los Angeles or in Tokyo, places like that. It's not it's not rigid in the ground.
Whoa.
Um, yeah, because so like if this makes sense, those materials though, when you try to turn them sideways, like it's just too heavy. Like it can't actually hold it together enough to even go over like a tree. So that's part of the misconception, at least according to these engineers, is that yeah, like part of the reason why it looks like it's a demolition when it comes down like that, if it doesn't come down in like pieces, is well two things. So one thing is yeah, it's just not strong enough, and the other thing, which I was going to say to them, but I might as well just say now, like what happens is when the top part starts collapsing, everything like whatever collapses, it puts that much more weight. So just think like if you had 3 floors in the building, if the first floor collapses, now the second floor is holding weight in a way that it wasn't, right? Because before all the pressure was through the columns to the side,
Yeah.
but now like now that floor, the second floor, is holding all the crap from the third floor, and then that breaks, and then that falls in the first, you know what I mean? And it's like, so imagine that times like 50 stories. Like it just comes down like a string of dominoes where it's just too much weight, like literally. And then unfortunately every floor that breaks just makes that much more like just mandatory, or inevitable that the floor underneath it would break. So, okay, that's one of the ideas, and then the reason why
Hmm.
was, as you said, all this fire. It turns out, will like in the twin towers, the idea was the airplanes hitting, actually not, since they can't use asbestos anymore, they use this like spray on fire protection stuff. But it turns out that like steel, if it's on fire for a long time, it eventually, the term they use is mushy. So the steel gets kind of softer, and then all it takes is like a little bit of like weakness for something to fail. And they also said that like, hey, from all the collisions and stuff going on, some of these columns were actually knocked out of whack. So they weren't even like holding the pressure in the right way anymore. So
Yeah.
that led to some issues. And then, once that happens, it's like this snowball rolling down a hill.
Uh,
So
yeah,
yeah.
just 1 second to give you another breather, right? Because you have been putting in work really well this week. Like I
I'm
don't,
talking too much this episode, I
not,
think.
not dude,
I'm
because
gonna get all kinds of comments. Like I can just see it.
nah, dude.
Grandpa
Oh,
Glenn
oh,
is just like
look,
that
dude.
jerk that left a comment the other day. But
Oof.
yeah.
But this is a good look how it's exploding, right? I think we just
Yeah.
since we're watching this real time, I think it's good to react. Yeah, the explosions are definitely crazy, right? I will say one thing, right? uh, I wanted to mention one detail because I think it's a good place to mention it since we're jumping back a little bit to the Twin Towers just for a few seconds, right? So apparently, it would be really hard to place like sort of demolition devices in the building, right? I believe I have this written down. I believe 47 columns would have to have demolition sort of like dynamite or whatever they would use in this type of a demolition attached to those columns, right? I think you can't just attach it to those columns. I think you have to like sort of work into the column a little bit, like get inside of the column and place it in the middle of it, or close in the middle, right? You can't just sort of like it's not going to be a sticky bomb situation where you just like glue a sticky bomb next to a column. That's not going to work in my opinion, or at least that's what I've read. So it would make no sense like how, and it would take, like it wouldn't be a 1 day job. It would be like a good month job at least, or like at least 2 weeks or something. Like it would take more than 1 day, I would assume for sure. So how did no one, no occupants, no people going to work or anything like that, no one actually ever reported any sort of demolition devices being placed in the building next to the columns? There's no like suspicious government dudes placing bombs all over the place. No one's noticing that. No one's reporting that. There are no reports like that coming out, or at least not that I know of. Well, 1 year prior to the explosions, to the demolitions, I mean the accident with the airplanes, right? 1 year prior to that, there was a elevator renovation happening in the buildings, and actually through the elevator shaft you could actually gain access to every single column that you need to gain access to. Obviously this still raises a lot of questions. I'm not saying that that's what happened, but you could gain access. So the access to the necessary columns where you would have to place the explosions was, at least in theory, gained by the company that was doing work. I think someone should look into that company. I'm pretty sure people have already did so. I don't know the findings of that. Probably nothing too sensational, since this I had to like search for this detail. But yeah, so this is pretty crazy. 1 year prior to the explosions, there was work in the Tower 7, in the Twin Towers. The Tower 7, I don't have this information, probably not, but in the Twin Towers there was like elevator renovations through the elevator shaft. You could gain access to every single one of those columns. It would still be really loud. It would, the people who, like the janitors and things like that, I have no idea how they would not notice anything. Maybe it was being done like not on work hours or something like that, but I'm assuming janitors like stayed there all night in multiple shifts and things like that, or like cleaning ladies, because cleaning ladies, at least in all the offices that I've worked at, they like usually start their work like not on working hours, so that they wouldn't like sort of get in the way of like everyone who's in the office and things like that. So I'm not really sure how you would be able to still do that even if you gained access to the necessary columns, but at least the access in theory to those columns was there. So that's just one thing I want to mention, since we stopped a little bit at the twin towers. So yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I mean, I guess like you mentioned, it would require a vast conspiracy. I mean, those big demolitions that take a month to set up, that's on a building that's been gutted. So there's not walls in the way. And yeah, I mean, it's like, okay, it makes sense, I guess, to my same point. If it only takes some weakness to cause that chain reaction, just maybe it doesn't happen cleanly, then yeah, maybe you could lay out those materials. But to your point, you would think that either all the maintenance people and other people that would spot, like this, it's not just the people working on the elevator that see the elevators, right? Like there's like the staff that works maintenance and janitorial services and cleanup and things like that. There would be other people that would be in the way and have their eyes on some of the places that needed to be rigged for demolition. So they would either have to be in on it or just be totally ignorant. And I don't know, the facilities people I know, they're not too ignorant. I mean, they seem to really know their stuff. So that's just worth pointing out. I guess the other part that's sort of interesting, like you mentioned, um, the sounds of explosions, and I know some people mention dust, like dust gusts. You know what I mean? Like when you see like an actual demolition, when all those charges go off, you see like that kind of like,
Mm.
you know what I mean, like this burst
Cloud
of
of
the little
dust, right?
micro,
Yeah.
yeah, the little clouds of dust that come up and down the floor. So like it didn't look exactly like that, right? When you look at it, it just looks like the whole building falls. But that's what people point to when they're worried about, that this was a controlled demolition. The fact that it didn't seem like, to them, it just felt like the whole building failed at once. And in their minds, it doesn't really follow like what they would think a building like that would fall. Now, the kind of the burst of dust thing and explosions and noise, I always think of, if you ever watch a video of like big waves, when big waves close out, and by close out I mean like a big wave, like a big wave that somebody would surf like in the North Shore.
Mm-hmm.
When it closes out from one end to the other, there's always this huge. It's pretty awesome. There's like this burst of like mist that comes out the other end, and like that was an explosion, right? What happened was it's air pressure. So when the wave is closing, when that pocket of space closes, it pushes all the air out the other end, right?
Okay.
So a big building full of air, and smoke and other crap, like the parts that aren't solid, as the building compresses, it's pushing that air has to go somewhere, right? Like it's going to go out the side.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, the other thing was, supposedly they've done these analyses of like the actual video and audio of the scene, and so far when they do the analysis, they're not finding the telltale. So like the actual evidence, like yeah, there's anecdotal people that claim that they heard something, but when they actually take the recordings, however much you trust the recordings, um, they're like, hey, you don't hear the explosions in the recordings because it was like the most
Dude,
photographed and videographed.
yeah,
Yeah.
I want to add this one detail because I think someone in the comments might mention this, so I just want to get in between in advance to this detail, right? There was a dude who was recording an audio to the tower that was next to the, or not necessarily a tower, I think it wasn't even a skyrise tower. Well, all those towers around Tower 7 are pretty big, but in comparison to Tower 7 or the Twin Towers, it's probably not that big of a tower, right? There was a dude there, and he was recording something. He was having a conversation with his colleagues. I think everyone could find this, but he did capture like some sort of sort of a explosion sounds a little bit. Like it was definitely iffy if that was actually an explosion sound, but there were like some sort of like explosiony type of sounds on his recording. Definitely he was not talking over during those times, and you could actually see the audio waveform that someone has done on YouTube just to show that whole conversation that he was having with his colleagues. and the audio waveform was like completely still, indicating that no one's actually speaking. Then there were like these big like explosions, like boom, and then another like boom, and something like that. So there were like explosions recorded by someone, but to your credit, there was a whole bunch of people on the ground filming, right, and recording, and it doesn't really seem like, uh, besides testimony of people, we don't have any like sort of videos, or maybe we do, but I have not ran into any sort of videos that would sort of really indicate like explosions, if you know what I mean, besides the one
Yeah.
that the dude captured on his like video recording, right?
So that's where it's like, yeah, I mean, if you don't have a preponderance of evidence, it's hard to make extraordinary claims. I'll give you. So there's this one of the things I think it is worth hashing out here in terms of like, well, what evidence would there be? Would there be physical evidence at least if there was explosions? And so that was where a lot of the focus was that, as much as you can look at like eyewitness testimony or kind of he said she said about who said what, or what, whether there was a call for
Dude, one second.
controlled demolitions.
One
Yeah.
second, just to interrupt you for 1 second. Are we still talking about Tower 7, or are we talking about the Twin Towers? Just so that to clarify for the
To-
audience.
uh, in this case, still Tower 7. I mean, you
Okay,
could apply this to the Twin Towers, but
okay.
it's the same argument. So the argument is controlled demolitions, whatever tower, because there was also that accusation about the twin. People, the same thing that was unsettling about Tower 7 was unsettling about the Twin Towers, where you look at those things and the way they collapse. Even when you consider that's a massive amount of weight that is failing, and that's why it like something that big, when it collapses, it can't help but kind of turn itself into dust because it's not strong enough to survive those kind of pressures. Okay, but like not everybody believes that. So it's always been the claim that those towers were also you know set for demolition. But let's, like I said, we'll take that bigger argument and push it down into the example of Tower 7 being one of the towers that was had that accusation, and the one on video that people say, just look at that, that's just obviously a controlled demolition. Okay, well, there were not just kind of run of the mill people saying that. There were actual, like, literally college professors. One of them was this guy over at BYU, so Brigham Young University. This Professor Jones. I'll just see what his name. I think it was like Bob Jones. Um, and anyway, he was like a super credentialed guy. Like he had multiple degrees from big time universities like Stanford.
Mm.
And he really early on, um, he had a problem with what he saw. He really suspected that there was at least some. It should be considered the theory that maybe there was some kind of demolition, that the what happened was not as described. And it's interesting because here it is, Stephen E. Jones. Yeah, so he came out pretty early on in the first couple of years after 9/11 with some papers, and he got a lot of pushback at his university. So Brigham Young University essentially, they found it embarrassing. So did a lot of his colleagues there at the university, and they pretty much pressured him to leave. So rather than let him defend his paper, it looks like he decided to exit. But it's still worth addressing. Like, well, what did he claim? So he claimed that a form of thermite. So thermite is um, uh, sensibly a demolition material, or can be. It's something. Thermite is a chemical combination that you can use to burn through even steel.
Just
It burns it.
just a
Yeah.
quick mention, and to give you another breather. So yeah, basically, termite was actually a topic of discussion on the documentary that I was watching, that was debunking the conspiracy theories regarding 9/11. And what they actually found is that termite could not burn through those steel beams or like the columns. But I will say it was really funny how they did it. because they they said, okay, so we have this termite and we're gonna test it out on on like a steel uh, column that holds, that would be a very similar column that would have been used in the twin towers, you know, in the construction when they were building the twin towers, right? And they couldn't burn through it, but beforehand they also said we can't get a hold of like the super termite because there's apparently a thing called super termite that only the military has, and there's like it's super hard to get. So this production crew with like a big budget, like they had like millions of dollars, I would assume, in that budget of that the debunking documentary, and they couldn't get a hold of super termite. So apparently they tested it out with regular termite and it could not burn through it, but they couldn't test it with super termite. And just in general, that documentary was pretty funny. How at the end of the day they came out looking shaky, like the official story guys. They came out, it's their documentary, they do the talking, they do the whole script, they prepare like the videos and everything like that, they make the documentary, and at the end of the day they come out really shaky out of that documentary. You know, their statements really shaky. They're like, the termite wouldn't work, but we don't have super termite, but don't pay attention to the super termite. So that's all I wanted to add, man.
Yeah, so one actually to that point, one of the types of thermite that Jones cited was something called nanothermite. So nanothermite is essentially a kind of thermite where the granules of it are super small. It's like a almost like a kind of mic the thermites in little microscopic pieces. And this was I guess maybe that's the super thermite you mentioned, where it's supposed to be make it extra effective. And what he would do is, this is where you get into once again disagreements about the evidence. So he and some of his supporters, some of whom were, you know, accomplished academics and scientists like himself, said, hey, if you look at the what was left of, you know, Tower 7 and the Twin Towers, there are signs that some kind of thermite was in there. There's like different chemical residue or different material, you know, material elements, metals, things like that, that are potentially a sign that thermite was used. And you know, that would also be the case. I mean, case in point, when something like the Oklahoma City bombing happened, or any other kind of major bombing, they always look for.
Think we lost you for a few seconds. Yeah, dude.
Did you lose me?
Yeah, we lose you. Just, I think you should repeat like the last 1 minute of what you've said,
Oh yeah.
because yeah.
So yeah, I mean, that was the thing, is when it comes to things like any kind of explosive that gets used, there's always going to be some kind of chemical trace, some kind of signature of the explosive. And in fact, for a lot of the commercially available explosives, like if you're a demolition person working in construction, there will sometimes actually be intentionally signatures introduced, so that if you ever did like a terrorist or a criminal act with a commercially available explosive, they would be able to help trace back like where the explosive came from and maybe find you. But even in the case of explosives that are used by the military, or you know, that someone manufactured, there would be certain things, just like an arson investigation, they can kind of tell like, well, this is what they used to start the fire. So that was the same idea. However, from what I've seen, probably you and I have watched some of the same videos, people have gone back and said, A, we don't really have a good chain of custody for the evidence that you use for this analysis in the case of Jones and his colleagues. And you know, that's actually been a big criticism in general of all the, you know, back and forth. Like kind of also in support of Jones is the criticism that a lot of the focus was on cleanup and not really on gathering evidence. Like they kind of figured they knew what happened, like it was on TV, everybody saw it. So like a lot of just the massive amount of rubble and other crap that they had to clean out of there, and frankly, pieces of people, and you know, all kinds of stuff ground, you know, hazardous chemicals, waste, etc. A lot of it they just got rid of as fast as they could without really preserving it for a criminal investigation. So you
One
know,
thing,
fair
one
enough.
thing, one
Yeah.
thing to mention, dude. I'm sorry that I'm interrupting like this, but one thing to mention. If I'm not mistaken, they shipped like almost all of the steel from it to China. What was that all about? Have you heard anything? Because apparently they shipped everything
Um,
to China.
Well, China for sure for the longest time was buying all of our spare metal, and that's why there was a big metals market was just raging because China, when they were ramping up their economy during this period, and stealing our jobs, um, they were they were buying as much metal as they could. So that's why copper and everything else was also being shipped to China. Um, China was hoarding metal. China was even hoarding our trash. For a long time, China was buying our excess plastic, like just junk plastic. They stopped doing that. By the way, they don't buy our crap plastic anymore. But they were just buying as much stuff as they could because they were just making so much stuff. Um, but yeah, it was that. But also, I also heard that there was a big kind of scandal with some amount of it because I don't know if you know this, like the mafia is involved in trash collection.
Yeah,
Um,
of
it's a
course.
big
Yeah.
thing in the East Coast, yeah, like the Sopranos. Well, there's a whole thing about like how some of the what they got rid of, maybe not the metal that they could sell to China, but other stuff, some of it was maybe improperly disposed of, and like there were like human remains in there, right? But
Whoa.
maybe the yeah, I mean, right, because of these buildings, maybe not in Tower 7 as much, but whatever splashed over from Towers 1 and 2,
Yeah.
and of course in the actual footprint of 1 and 2. Yeah, it's pretty ugly to think about. It's pretty awful all the way around, but yeah. So anyway, when they go and they look at the materials, kind of the counter argument from people that accept the conventional explanation is, hey, like, guess what? Those same things that you say are evidence of thermite kind of also happen when a huge building falls down. Like, it's just because can you imagine how much heat and pressure and mixing up of all these different materials, like the things they're pointing out and saying that's thermite. Well, they're saying, well, the building's also made out of that. You know that, right? Like, it's not it's not like you don't have that if you don't have thermite. Like, no, like that, that stuff that like magnesium and all these things that thermite's made out of, like it's also in the building.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's not even some of like this particular structure of remains, like these kind of micro bubbles or whatever they were talking about. I saw like a TED Talk style thing, but it was like an actual academic talk, and the guy's like, oh no, like if you just do that right now and burn up a beam, like you'll get the same kind of thing. So
Yeah.
anyway.
Dude, really excellent. I want to add one thing. Remember how I said there were these explosions and things like that, and you could like see explosions below, like the first layer of the collapse, right? So, dude, just pay attention to. I will bring out my mouse right now for this. Just pay attention if you can see to this right exact area, and everyone who's in the audience right now, I would suggest looking right now. I hope I will get this correct. So basically, I will try to stop this frame by frame and just pay attention to this, right? So this is the general collapsing layer that sort of brings down one of the towers, right? I'm not sure if this was the north or the south tower, but like just pay attention to this general area. There will be an explosion coming out of one of these bottom layers. So I'll just try to go frame by frame, just tapping. I think. Okay, so first of all, I think we are seeing something here already, but it's still pretty close to the general layer. So I think you could explain. Okay, so maybe one of the columns just sort of collapsed below the general layer of the collapse and things like that. I wanna go frame by. Okay, so now we're seeing a little area here as well. Maybe this is just the smoke from the general smoke, but this thing is exploding quite hard. But we will see. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I can just address it when it's happening. I mean, that's not so like the part that you're seeing that's all smoky and like poking out.
yeah.
That's like it's already happened there, right? But you got to figure inside that thing, like the actual collisions and stuff, like stuff's getting pushed down inside it, right? So all the air pressure, all the floors falling on each other, like they're pushing air out below them. It's like if you take a big sack and you make a bubble and you squeeze it at the top, like you know what I mean? It pokes out at the
Sure,
bottom.
sure,
So
sure.
that's the way I see it. Like
I,
so
I,
from when I see that, that's like literally it failing
I
underneath it.
I'm not like arguing that this was like a demolition or
Yeah.
anything like that. I'm just pointing out interesting facts here, and I do agree with you. You're making real good points, but this is not even the craziest one. We're gonna be seeing a crazier one than this or this one. Let me just finish up the frame. So I'm gonna try to go through the frame. Okay, see, this is what I was talking about. So this one is definitely one of the ones that cause a lot of suspicion demolition. It's happening like way below the general area, right? And I want to add a few more frames, right? It does seem like something called, like I could understand that this being like just things inside of it getting collapsed, and I'm really happy that you addressed it and made it made it made sense of this. But I just want to add that this particular one on this particular footage is pretty much what led a lot of people to believe that there were explosions happening. So I don't know. There's one thing to want I wanted to add. So, but I definitely understand what you meant, and
No, yeah,
I would actually probably go with your theory here. There were other footages where it really looks like an explosion here. It does seem like pressure sort of collapsed below the general layer of the collapse, and just air just pushed it out of the building. So it made sense here. There were some other videos where it looked really crazy, like it was a real explosion, like a action movie explosion. But I think you could sort of have the same reasoning that you just had. I just wanted to leave that there. You know what I mean?
no, it's a good point. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to
It's okay.
interrupt like
It's
that.
okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point because I think, to your point, I'm not an expert, and I mean, for all me saying stuff and explaining it, someone else could point at that, and neither me nor that other person could know, like, hey, for sure what's going on in that building, right? Like we have an explanation from different people about what's going on, but like we're not there, like we don't. And then like to your point, someone could easily point at that, and I could see why, especially given all the other stuff that happened after 9/11, why someone might not trust the conventional explanation. Maybe that's actually a good segue, I think, into, what do you think, the thoughts and reactions part of our
Exactly. Yeah, I think
our
I think
show right now?
it's perfect. So,
Yeah.
for me personally, since I don't have probably as much reactions and thoughts as you do, I will say that off the bat, personally, before looking into it, I thought that it was always something funny to me when I would look at the George Bush memes about 9/11. They always looked really funny to me personally. I will say that I thought I didn't have a strong opinion because I didn't know the details. After looking at the details, I will say that it's, if you watch like the pro conspiracy people, like the truthers and things like that, you will really start believing in them. There's a really good movie about this, Loose Change, the second edition. It's on YouTube. It's completely free. It's this dude who talks about like the inconsistencies. It's a really well made movie. It explains everything really well. I will say he had like some really like catchy like cool music in the back. He seemed really confident when he was talking, and I think that sort of confidence and the catchy music in the back, like everything's like really cool how he's explaining it, and you start believing him because like he's the cool guy, and you want to believe in the cool guy. So I think you have to take that out of the consideration and watch like debunking conspiracies. The one that I've watched like didn't inspire confidence, like they came out like looking really weak. So maybe there are some better ones, but I will say that, for me personally, after looking into it, I will say one thing that stood out to me. Uh, Apparently, there would have to be around 10 or like 5,000 people in on it in total, something like that, or the number would be close. So I find it hard to believe that so many people could be in on it. And the other thing I will say, like Tower 7, exploding the Tower 7 sort of makes sense because there's a lot of documents that if they get destroyed all of a sudden, and as you've mentioned, probably those documents were not backed in the cloud services or anything like that. So when they're gone for good, right? So that would sort of make sense. The Twin Towers also would make sense because, oh my God, it's such a catastrophic thing that happened, and let's invade Iraq. Let's do it, guys. So that would make sense, right? The psychological trauma, okay, it makes sense, right, to serve a purpose. But the Pentagon doesn't make any sense to me because it seems to me like overkill. I will say that there's a lot of like shady details to the Pentagon. There's no footage of the plane actually hitting the Pentagon. It's being theorized that a missile was hitting the Pentagon, and I will agree. Like the Pentagon after the crash does not look like it had an airplane crashed into it. There's like only a small hole in the Pentagon and things like that. But just from a big picture standpoint, would you really also attack the Pentagon? Would you really have that other plane that was allegedly heading to the White House? Because I think the conspiracy theory explanation is that they actually hit that plane with a missile so that it would not reach the White House and things like that. But aren't those other two things a little bit of an overkill? For the general theory, I think if it was a conspiracy, I think just the things that happened in New York would be more than enough for, the George Bush administration to launch war, and all the other gains that would be gained from such a conspiracy theory, right? Would attacking the Pentagon and then the White House potentially, that's to me like overkill, and a lot of things could go even more wrong, like more loose ends would come out and someone would spill the beans. I think you could pretty much just demolish Tower 7 and you would have enough justification to go to war in Iraq. So I think everything, it's like too much of an overkill to also go at these other locations. So I will say I find it from a big picture standpoint, I find it really hard to believe that it was all staged, planned, and all of these people are now keeping their mouth shut. But I will say an investigation into this matter should be relaunched because there's a whole bunch of like crazy details that I have no explanation, but I just find it really hard to believe that a conspiracy like that just worked out perfectly and now we're invading Iraq. So I don't know, I find it hard to believe. So I hope everyone understands my rationale, and that's all I have, dude.
Yeah, I mean, it's you make an excellent point because I think I always felt like out of all the conspiracy theories about 9/11, this was almost like the least imaginative to me, where I was like, or the least interesting. Where, yeah, to your point, I mean, besides the fact that like the Pentagon one, I mean, Rogan always mentions this one. He's not wrong. Rumsfeld, right before 9/11, had given this big speech about how there was like, I don't know, $4 billion that was unaccounted for, and they were about to do a big audit, and then bam, this plane hits the Pentagon exactly in the place where the records were, supposedly. So much for your audit.
Yeah.
Things like that, or I mean, there was a bunch of other stuff where it was like, how much did the Saudis know? How much did the U.S. establishment know this attack was coming? And that's always been the theory I found interesting, was that the thought was like, maybe certain people in the know. It wasn't that like you don't need to set up demolition in buildings if you know an attack's coming, and you kind of just make it easier for it to happen. So the fact that that FBI guy was waved away when he started discovering the plot and honing in on suspects, and they said, "Oh no, don't worry about that. CIA's got it," or whatever. Or the fact that like they had just happened to be doing a big Air Force defense exercise the day of the attack, where they're like the whole eastern seaboard was like not being protected. That's always just things like that. There's a whole bunch of things like that. Or the fact that after we caught Bin Laden, we threw his body away. Like, I don't get that part at all. Like, that's really suspicious to me. I don't really understand why we would do that when we spend all that time looking for this guy. And so okay, that's another show. I'll bring it home, and I'll try to go real quick here. Just finish off with, I always think like something like this, for this particular kind of conspiracy theory. Maybe it's just part of the reason why everybody wants an alternative explanation, is that it's kind of a way to rationalize an unfair world, and maybe a terrifying or horrifying world. The idea that, you know, the world is very unpredictable, and that these kind of big, out of control disasters could happen, and even, the most powerful government in the world couldn't do much to really stop it or fix things once it got going. I always think of, like, you see those pictures of the people that had to jump out of the towers to their own death because the fire was at their backs. And whenever I see that picture of like that one guy that's like upside down, who's falling, um, I forget what they call him, the falling man or something. And I'm always like, can you imagine people like him? Like, literally that morning, they never thought that they would be jumping out of that building to their own deaths and be glad they did it, right? I mean, just because they were going to burn up. And, just, I mean, that I think was the thing that made me so crazy. But yeah, you don't really think about it. We're living on a rock that's hurtling through space. And any moment, bam, something could happen. Here's the other thing is, if there was a conspiracy, would we even find out about it? Because would it be something that was so dangerous and so damaging? And the example I always think of is Dan Carlin on his show Hardcore History. He gives an example where what if what if the Russians, like a rogue faction of like the Soviet Union, had killed JFK? Would they have even told us about it? I mean, by the way, that stuff's still secret. All these years later, supposedly there's still there's some kind of defense secrets that they have to keep the JFK stuff files all under wrap. What the hell? It's like 70 years ago. How are we still not hearing about that? But yeah, like that was the idea, was that suppose Soviet Union had killed JFK, not saying they did, they're just using that example. Would that have been something so crazy and so outrageous that we would have gone to nuclear war? So instead of telling us that, just for our own good, tell us, oh yeah, this crazy guy up in the book depository building blew his head off, and no, nothing to worry about here. Keep buying, Pampers and Ford. I don't know. It's like an interesting food for thought. Where like if there is a conspiracy, is that why they keep it from us? Because it's just too dangerous for us to, like, it would upset things too much.
Hmm.
But, I guess the other thing to point out is, as we alluded to before, no one really expected this much to go wrong at once. I mean, short of a nuclear war, this was almost like a minor nuclear attack, right? It was where like so much stuff was broken that you couldn't even get started fixing it because the stuff you needed to fix it with was also broken. Like it would just became like this crazy event where it was too much broken to even like try to pick up the pieces. And I think really like it shows you how everybody was in shock after this. The city was in shock. The country was in shock. Really, I think it was like a really eye-opening thing about what like a real super big disaster looks at. And it's pretty awful. Unfortunately, this disaster turned out to be a much bigger disaster, like you said, the Gulf War and all the other stuff after it. Literally, millions of people died because of this thing happening. And I don't mean millions of people died in New York. I mean all over the world, because of the chain of events and the trillions of dollars that we have spent, or that other countries have spent, everyone has spent, because of this event, because of what happened. It totally changed the course of history. And frankly, bin Laden might have actually gotten what he wanted in a way. That's maybe also food for thought for another discussion. But when you really think about it, he kind of got us to react in a way that probably wasn't totally in our own best interest if you look at the results and ISIS and all that other stuff that happened afterwards. Finally, I just like to conclude that, I guess the other sad part about this is the event itself. It killed a few thousand people here in the US, and that's not nothing. That's, for sure a major event. It's horrifying. Um, but and it's worth pointing out that a couple of years after this, the tsunami that happened in Indonesia and Thailand killed almost 250,000 people at once, right? So it wasn't just like the stuff that happened afterwards. Like literally a couple, almost 250,000 people got killed in this one event, and we don't really think about that event.
Whoa.
Maybe because it happened in a different part of the world. You know anything about it? Like, yeah, we think about this, and it's such a big deal, and it was a big deal. I mean, 9/11 wrecked a lot of things. It wrecked it, did a lot of financial damage. Some people even think that the people that died in 9/11 in those towers were the people, the kind of financial geniuses that could have stopped the financial disaster of like 2007 and 2008. That those very
Mm.
minds that would have worked for the government and helped spot the issues and enforce the rules, etc. We lost a lot of like very important people, very important minds in that. So it's interesting that when you kind of weigh them against literally hundreds of thousands of people in Thailand and Indonesia who died, drowned, were crushed in the tsunami. But like we don't really, remember that too much. I'm sure in those countries they do, but to us, because it didn't really happen in the I guess the advanced economies you might call them, It happened in a developing part of the world. It's fascinating that stuff like that happens in the other parts of the world all the time, and they probably look at us and they're like, "Hey, well, we understand like a big part of your city got damaged and you guys lost a few thousand people, but like, we had a monsoon and we lost 100,000 people last year. So, like, did you guys cry for us?" So it's kind of interesting to think about that. I'm not saying that that opinion's right, but it does give you a little perspective. Yet, for all that damage, 9/11 is by far, undoubtedly, probably the most important thing that happened in that time period, right? So,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, so I think we're gonna wrap it up, dude. The excellent roundup as always, dude. It's really, I didn't even realize that those things were happening, in Southeast Asia and things like that. I will have to look into them, and you just brought up a great point, I think, for everyone in the audience as well, for myself. So yeah, this was 9/11, the Tower 7 episode, right? So next week we're actually going back to a true crime case, a lesser known true crime case, and I think no one in the audience, or maybe like only a few people in the audience, will know about that case. There's not a lot of information, so we'll see what we can dig up for you guys. It's a really cool case in terms of like it being fascinating. Obviously, I'm not a big fan of those things happening to anyone, but like it's a cool case to look at. So that's coming up for you next week. I will say that this week I may also, for everyone who's still listening to this, I don't know how many people are listening to the end of the podcast, but I will be posting probably a like 6 hour thing on SMP regarding the Delphi murders case. So I don't know if it's gonna come out this week or not. I do have all of the like things complied in there, so also look out for that. I think there's gonna be a content overload on SMP this week, but I think it's a good thing. So yeah, as always, guys, stay safe. Peace out, and yeah, we'll catch you on the next week's episode. And yeah, chill out.